I was in the shower and I had one idea for how that we would just come in, y'all would ask questions, we'd do whatever. I changed my mind. I think what we'll do today is I'm going to walk us through our concept map of what we've covered so far in class, just to kind of like refresh our brains. And what I'd like to do is, hopefully you came to class with some questions that as we talk about these things, if we're talking about power and you had a question about power, ask it then. Okay, so like let's kind of integrate the questions as we review. And then I decided to make y'all a study guide for this exam. I don't typically do study guides, but you know, it's just a different semester all around. And y'all can't, 21 of y'all came to class on Tuesday. So I put together a study guide and I'll give that to y'all kind of towards the end. Y'all can look it over and ask any more questions there. So does that sound like a good game plan? Yeah. Okay, so start of the semester. Very first thing we did is we defined leadership. All right, y'all need to know the definition of leadership according to Northouse. So I don't have it written on here, but you should, that should be a sentence that you kind of know by heart for this class. Okay, leadership is a process where an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. So that's where I've identified the key parts. If I gave y'all a question that said, what's the definition of leadership? I'm going to be looking for that Northouse definition. And you know, I get it. You may not know it word by word by word, but these are going to be the key things I look for. Do you use the word process? Do you talk about the fact that an individual person influences a group of individuals and that they're working to achieve a common goal? Those are the main key parts, because again, that's driving everything we're doing this semester. Any questions about the definition of leadership? Okay. And so then from there, we talked about leader versus manager. So this portion up here, okay? I want you to look back at chapter 1. And you need to know just kind of what are those characteristics of a leader? What are the characteristics of a manager? How does that make them different? And then in the management and leadership process, how does that look different in an organization as well? So the big thing, and I've kind of put it on here, is that leaders are focused on the future, whereas managers are focused on maintaining status quo. Okay? So leaders are going to be more relational. Managers are going to care more about organizing, structuring, and kind of being reactive to things that happen. So again, kind of look back. It's a short section of chapter 1, but it's pretty important. And then we said, okay, before we even talk about leadership and all these different theories, we've got to understand what do we mean by the word influence in our definition. And ultimately, we're talking about power. So power, if you were asked to define what power is influence. Okay, so those two words are synonymous with each other. Power is influence is power. And ultimately, that means getting what you want, given what's available. And so you've got to remember there's 5 main power bases. So these are the 5. What's the 6th one that kind of got added later on? It's not up here. Kind of was added before the technology boom, before we knew everybody would have access to the internet. Information. So information power. That's kind of that 6th one. And then you need to know, and I've kind of put here, we consider 2 of them to be personal power bases, 2 of them considered to be positional. But then we always have to think about, again, if we're trying to get people to do what we want, they're ultimately going to react to what we do. So there's 3 main reactions. So you need to know those. People are going to be committed, they're going to comply, or they're going to resist. And you can see where I've drawn on my little mind map some arrows to kind of say, well, if people are just going to comply, that's probably because I used either expert, legitimate, or coercive power. So it's just for me to kind of keep track of, okay, I need to understand if I'm going to use coercive power, This is probably how my followers are going to react to what I ask them to do.
Where would information power lie position?
So information power, the reason why we don't, like it got added as a sixth one, and you can mention it, but we don't talk about it as much anymore because it's kind of gone to the wayside now that we do, like everyone has a little bit more equal access to information. So people can't hold that power kind of over your head anymore. So I always think about the fact that, you know, back in the 1970s, you got your information if you were in college from the professor and the textbook you had from class and the library. Well, now y'all can step outside of the classroom and Google anything I say. Okay? So, any specific questions about power? Any more? Do y'all have a question?
Yeah, what is the, I just can't read it, what is the 3 on the bottom on the very left side of power?
On the bottom? So we have, starting at the top, we have referent, reward, expert, legitimate, coercive. And those 3 are positional power bases. So again, the personal power bases, referent and reward, people do what you want them to do because you tend to have more of a personal relationship with them. The other 3, people are typically doing what you're asking them to do because you're in some type of position or authority to be able to use that power base. So if you think about it this way too, it's really hard to have expert power if you're not in a position where people consider you to be an expert, right? It's really hard to have legitimate power if you're not in a position that you actually do have a position. It's hard to have coercive power if you're not in a position to be able to use that coercive power. But then even with coercive power, we talked about that idea that are kids in a position in their family? Technically, yes, they have the position of being children. Do they use coercive power with their parents? We saw in our skit that we did. So one thing that'll be helpful for y'all, I think, as you're studying, and this is for all of the concepts, think back. Again, I hope in your notes during class you took notes about the examples we gave, the things we talked about. That's what's going to make these theories kind of come to life for you. So don't just study, this is what coercive power is. Have a third column next to that where you write an example of it, okay? I can give y'all a ton of my examples of these things, but honestly, y'all coming up with your own examples is really what's going to make these concepts become concrete and stick with you. And that's where too, studying and with a partner, hearing what examples they came up with, just the more you can do that, the more it's going to stick with you. Okay. So after we did that, we moved into kind of our first section here of theories. Okay. And it's trait theories, or you could call it the trait approach. And again, remember, this is all about this idea of who the leader is. All right, so we're focusing on that individual that's in our definition of leadership. And there was a little bit of discussion about, well, are leaders born or can leaders be made? And trait theory definitely falls along that line, and that thinking of leaders are born, okay? And it started out with great man theory. This idea that in the late 1800s, when we started to study leadership, the leaders that we had to look at were men. And so there had to be something different about them that made these men rise to the top among other men, to lead countries, to lead the military, to do whatever, okay? And we said that essentially within the trait approach, there's kind of 2 legs to it. We can either look at characteristics of people, so it's kind of those qualities, innate qualities of people, how we describe them, or we can look at their personality, and personality comes a little bit more from psychology, and just this idea of how people interact with the environment around them. That's what personality is. And so we have 5 major traits. The book talks about a bunch of different studies and people who did studies on traits of leaders, but ultimately we've kind of come up with this what we think is a succinct list, but again, it's not perfect. Intelligence, sociability, determination, self-confidence, and integrity. Okay? Know the definition of those. Know perhaps some reasons why research has shown that those tend to be traits we look for in leaders. Okay? Then on the other hand, on the personality side, we have the 5-factor model, or the Big 5 personality model. And you can use the acronym OCEAN to remember it. We learned with this particular theory that every person's personality, everyone's, it can essentially be divided up into 5 dimensions. And every person is somewhere along a continuum for each of those 5. So you can look back at your own assessment. You did a homework for this to remember how to interpret those scores. You notice on my little chart here, I have like a plus sign, an X, a negative sign. That was a reminder to me to say, okay, we don't necessarily know that leaders are effective based off of their personality, but we know people's perceptions of that effectiveness. So we know that the more open someone is, the more conscientious, the more extroverted someone is, it's plus. It's positively correlated with effective leadership. On the other hand, negative emotion or neuroticism is negatively correlated with effective leadership. So the more you display negative emotions, the less people are going to consider you to be an effective leader. Agreeableness, on the other hand, it is the only personality dimension that we say you don't really want to be highly agreeable or highly unagreeable. We want a leader somewhere in the middle. So there's not really a correlation there between agreeableness and effective leadership. So that's why the X is there. Any questions about Big 5 or about the 5 major traits? Anytime y'all see on my little chart the like dashed line, that again was me kind of telling myself like there's kind of a connection here, or these things might be similar, so that I could remind myself not to get confused. Because I can tell you one thing I often see on the exam, people get the 5 major traits mixed up with the Big 5 personality dimensions. Okay, so, sociability, extroversion, kind of the same thing. We talked in class a little bit about the difference between what those 2 things mean, so you can go back and watch the class video if you want to remind yourself of that. But they're ultimately 2 different things. One's a characteristic, one's a personality dimension. And then we had emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence, you either have personal competencies or social competencies. Emotional intelligence is all about how do you manage your emotions as well as your relationships and the emotions of other people. And we know that's important to leadership because leaders are working with other people. And again, it's considered to be a part of your personality, kind of, again, how you interact with other people. Here's a difference, though, to remember between Big 5 and emotional intelligence. When it comes to most personality things, we feel like it's pretty stagnant. Your personality isn't going to change a whole lot over time. But emotional intelligence does believe that that is something you can develop over time. So while you may have scored on the EQ homework perhaps low on emotional intelligence, with work, with development, you can increase the amount of emotional intelligence that you have. So again, a little bit different perspective between those 2 things. Any questions about trait approach? So there's 3 personal competencies. It's self-awareness, self-regulation, and motivation. So that's what it's abbreviated for. And then for social competencies, we have empathy and social skills. Emotional intelligence wasn't in your book. So if you don't have notes from that, there is a PDF that's in one of the week modules that has the descriptions of what these 5 competencies are. here is where we started moving. Behavior theory, there was a lot there. So we said, okay, and again, one thing you want to know, and your book does this in every chapter, it gives you strengths and weaknesses of kind of all the approaches. Know the strengths and weaknesses of trait approach. One of the weaknesses of the trait approach is just this idea, it's completely focused on the leader, and just because we study who the leader is doesn't tell us whether they're actually effective or not. People have perceptions, but there's issues with those perceptions, right? There's personal bias, there's cultural influences that play into why we think someone has to be tall for president. Did y'all know that has actually been shown over time to be one of the things people look for when they vote for president? If someone's too short, they're less likely, or considered short, they're less likely to vote for them. It's interesting. That was a side note. Take that home. Save it for trivia. So we said, well, we need to know a little bit more. So beyond just knowing who the leader is, we need to know what the leader does or how the leader acts. Okay, so this is all about behavior. That's what behavior theories or the behavior approach is about. And ultimately, it is based on this idea of task and relationship, right? So we said when you start to refer to your leadership style now, you're no longer going to talk about how nice you are or how much you listen to people. You're going to describe whether you're task-oriented, relationship-oriented, or somewhere in between. Okay, that is what leadership style or leader behavior is. And so what you need to know is that this idea of task and relationship, there is a connection back to personality. So again, there's this idea that you just kind of are the way you are. So it's still a little bit stuck in that idea that leaders are born. Okay? And we talked about several studies. The first being Ohio State, second one being at Michigan. Those two studies were done at the same time. Researchers didn't know that they were both doing it, but the results ultimately came up with the same thing. Leaders either act in a task-oriented manner or they act in a relationship-oriented manner. You want to know what they named those orientations, because of course they had to put their own little spin on it, right? But know what those are. Also, you probably want to know, one of the studies said you're either task or you're either relationship, one or the other. Another study said, no, we don't think it's that simple. We think you can be a mix of both. So you want to know who said what there and what that difference is. So then we have the B&M leadership grid, or the Blake and Mouton. Sometimes it's called the leadership grid, sometimes it's called the managerial grid. But they took this idea of task and relationship. They were the first person to actually use the word style, and they created this grid that essentially said there's 5 styles of leaders, of their behavior. And it's a certain combination of task and relationships, and again, they put their own spin on it. Task is always on the x-axis, relationships always on the y-axis. And it was impoverished, authority compliance, team, country club, middle of the road. Okay? Before I move into leadership continuum, any questions about that? About just the idea of task and relationship and these first styles? And again, what's unique here, is there anything being mentioned about followers yet? No. These are still very leader-centered, very much focused on this idea of being made. Okay. So then we have the leadership continuum. And so it's a little bit different take on task and relationship, just in that they're saying, okay, now we want to look at leaders or managers in the workplace. Their task and relationship orientation seems to affect how much they're willing to let followers help them make decisions or not. Okay, so this is what do leaders do? Do they let followers have a part in making decisions? If they tend to be more task-oriented, they're going to fall along this line of being autocratic. Okay, they're going to make decisions themselves. They're not going to confer with other people. They're going to tell people what to do. A little bit like a dictator is what we talked about. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you're going to have, if someone tends to be highly relationship oriented, they're going to be more democratic. So they're going to involve their followers in making decisions. They're going to share responsibilities. But they're also going to be willing to let it take more time to do those things. Autocratic leaders tend to like things to be done right away, and so for them it's easier to just make the decision. And we talked about how some situations warrant that, right? You can't always wait to get everybody around a board table and have a 2-week-long workshop when a decision needs to be made in 2 days. And then over here on this side, we have this fun little style that's not even on the continuum, because it means the absence of leadership. A laissez-faire, no leadership. The leadership continuum is kind of the first one to acknowledge that we may have people in leadership positions who are kind of like that impoverished leader. They're not tasked, they're not relationship oriented. They don't even perhaps maybe even really want to be in that leadership position. So they just kind of, it may at first appear like they're democratic, but they're not providing feedback. They're not providing any type of structure to their group. Those of you that weren't in class the day that we talked about the leadership continuum, we did an activity outside. We built paper towers, and we had 3 groups, and each group was assigned one of these, and we kind of debriefed afterwards. What was it like to have a laissez-faire leader? What was it like to have a democratic? What was it like to have autocratic? And so I would encourage you to go back and kind of watch that video and listen to that debrief to make sure you really understand the difference between those 3. And again, just some connections there. Impoverished leader is a lot like the laissez-faire. Team leader is a lot like that democratic leader. Autocratic, very much similar to authority compliance. Okay. Why it's helpful to make those connections is that, who knows, I could ask you to compare and contrast a theory, right? And so you want to be thinking about what are the similarities between these, where are those connections, what are some of the differences. So then, any questions about behavior? I feel like I'm just like throwing fireballs at y'all. Everybody good? Feeling? None of this, is anybody freaking out saying, I don't remember learning about any of this? Okay, I just want to make sure. Okay. So, before we move forward in kind of the next area of theories, I said we got to step back a little bit. And we need to talk a little bit here about motivation. And so we kind of took, like I said, almost 5 steps backwards. And we said just talking about influence as power isn't really giving us the whole picture of what's happening here and what influence means. And so motivation theories really are an extension of that idea of influence that we had up here. And so we're saying not just getting people to do what we want, but we need to now understand why. Why are people willing to do what they do? Motivation, there's no such thing as a lack of, right? It's just why people do what they do. And so we had some major theories that we talked about, and a lot of them we said really the basis of a lot of things boils down to this idea of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Okay? Do you do things simply because you enjoy them and you have the personal desire, the personal burn to do those things? Or do you need something externally kind of pushing you along and encouraging you to do it? Right? So, 5 theories, 5 big theories that we talked about. I think first one that we'll discuss is this idea that we talked about reinforcement theory over here. So we talked about Skinner, okay? Skinner said that we can get people to do what we want them to do, and we can make them want to do it if we just try to control their behavior. So it's based off of Pavlov's dog experiment, right? Go back, you can learn a little bit more about that in psychology. But this idea of positive reinforcement, when people show a behavior that we think is good or we want them to continue repeating, we reward it. That's what positive reinforcement is. When people show a behavior that we want them to stop, what does Skinner say we should do? Beat them, right? No. That's not what negative reinforcement is. We ignore it. So negative reinforcement is ignoring bad behavior. I think that's really important to remember. It's not consequences. I think students get that confused a lot. Negative reinforcement isn't consequences. Again, I think about children who talk a lot. You want them to stop talking? Don't answer them. Ignore the behavior. Okay, or I guess not talking a lot, maybe crying. If they're just whiny. Ignore them. They'll eventually stop. Okay? And then we moved on to this idea of hierarchy of needs. And a guy named Maslow, he created this pyramid. And his take on motivation is that people will never get to the point of intrinsic motivation unless they have those kind of extrinsic motivators met. And those extrinsic motivators are certain needs, like psychological needs, safety and security, love and belonging. Anybody remember what the top two are that are a little bit more intrinsic?
Like living needs, like food and stuff?
So that's physiological needs. That's a very basic one. So love and belonging's third. Huh? Kind of. Affiliation kind of still fits in that love and belonging. Look back in house notes.
Self-esteem and self-actualization.
Self-esteem, self-actualization. So think about it, if you kind of are having a hard time remembering that the love and belonging is in the middle. Well, and of course, when you feel loved and like you're a part of something, it makes you feel good. So self-esteem. And then once you have that strong self-esteem, you can be self-actualized. And to Maslow, that means you are internally motivated for things. You feel like you're accomplishing your purpose in life. You kind of have that like, moment. That's what I always think of at the top of the pyramid. It's like there should just be like a glowing light out of it. Because to me it sounds a little hippy-dippy. But so, thank you for that. I at least appreciate one person laughs at me. Then from there, we said there's this other guy. His name's Herzberg, right? And he gave us another theory. It's called the two-factor theory. And he said that we could kind of take Maslow's idea of hierarchy of needs and really divide them into two different factors. That bottom factor, the number one, is what we call hygiene factors. So those are those external things that have to be met in order for you to be satisfied at work. So this one very much is like a workplace-oriented motivation theory. And it says, if you're going to be motivated to stay at your job and do well, you need certain hygiene factors met. That could be a good salary. That could be a comfortable workspace. It could be days off for vacation. Whatever those like basic hygiene things are. But then, if you're the employer and you're like, well, I provide all of those things for my employees. If you want them to be even more motivated, then you look at that second factor, which are motivating factors. So can you give incentives? Can you give, flexible work schedules instead of just time off? All of those additional things that you can do in the workplace to make people even more motivated to be there. We have theory X, theory Y. So again, another little take on motivation, 100% from the leader's perspective. And it's this idea of like, again, as a leader, are you kind of task-oriented or are you kind of relationship-oriented? And how does that affect how you perceive the people working for you or working with you, your followers? Theory X leader tends to think that people are lazy, that they don't want to come to work, they don't want to be there, and so they treat them accordingly. Theory X leader is like this big mesh of like an over-the-top task-oriented leader with an over-the-top autocratic leader. That they're just, again, they're not going to think that people at work are self-reliant. So they've got to tell them everything to do. They've got to reprimand them every time, because if not, they're not going to stay in line. That kind of thing. Theory Y leader, on the other hand, thinks that people, if they're at work, they must want to be there for what, and again, may not all have the same motivation to be there, but there's a reason why they do what they do, why they're there. So they tend to be more trusting. They tend to give more responsibility to their followers. Okay, there's a difference between those two. I just realized there's one other theory that I don't have written on here that was motivation. Can anyone remember? So needs theory, or acquired needs. So acquired needs was developed by this guy named McClelland, and he essentially said, again, Maslow had 5 hierarchy of needs, and he said, really, I think we can boil it down to the fact that people have one of 3 needs. And they could have them in varying degrees, but there's always going to be one that motivates people more to do what they do. The first one is going to be need for power. Second is a need for, anybody remember? Starts with an A. Affiliation. So they want to feel a part of something. They want to be a part of a group. They want friends. And the last one is the need for achievement. Okay. And then ultimately we said, okay, this is great. We've talked about intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, how it kind of underlies everything about motivation. We talked about 5 theories, which was a lot. And then we ended up, y'all took the MSI. And the MSI is based off of what we call a meta-analysis. Okay? So they looked at the whole history of research and motivation, and they ultimately said, we can come up with 5 sources of motivation. That if we look at people, if we ask that question, why do people do what they do? It's usually because they're motivated the most by one of these 5 sources. So intrinsic process, external self-concept, instrumental, internal self-concept, goal internalization. Okay, you want to know the difference between those? It might be really helpful for you to refresh yourself on even your results. Because again, when you look back at those 5 homeworks you've done, knowing your results is going to help make more sense of these theories because it's personal to you. You're going to remember, oh, well, I scored really high on instrumentals. You know you're going to remember that one because it describes who you are. So that's helpful to use those in your studying. And then on Tuesday, last but not least, we talked about locus of control and how it ties into motivation. Locus of control is this idea that we've got to understand why people do what they do, but oftentimes it can be influenced by whether they think they're in control of their environment or not in control of their environment. So do they have this sense of, I expect A to happen, or I expect B to happen, so if I do A, B will happen. Like I know if I make good grades or I study hard, I'm going to get a good grade on this exam. That would be someone with an internal locus of control. They feel like they can make the decisions, choices, have certain behaviors that are going to kind of control the outcome that they expect to get. An external locus of control person, on the other hand, feels like things happen to them, that they're not in control of what goes on. And so if they get a bad grade on a test, it's not because they didn't study, it's because the professor just wrote a crappy test. I mean, it is what it is. I've been that student that blamed it on a professor. So, I think we've all probably been in that at some point. And we talked about on Tuesday with our locus of control results that very rarely do people score very high internally. It takes a lot of development. This is a motivation theory that's tied a lot into personal or child and adult development, and that for a lot of people's lives, you're gonna have this external locus of control as a child. Because as a kid, are you able to make a whole lot of choices? No. But depending on how people are raised, they may over time start to be given agency, which is going to help them develop that internal locus of control. On the other hand, we have children that are just in really bad situations that legitimately stuff happens to them that is out of their control. And unless they are put in a better environment, that's going to be how they continue to develop over time. So again, for those of us in education, it's so important for us to think about that what can we do to meet them in the middle and provide those opportunities for agency and developing that confidence to have an internal locus of control. And hopefully, it'll all make sense next week after our exam, why we had to kind of take this break to pop back with motivation theory. Because again, motivation is all about that idea of influence in leadership. And so we need to know not just how do we get people to do what we want, but we need to understand why they're going to do. Why are they going to react the way they act? Why are they going to choose to do the things they do? Especially if we're going to try to look at a little bit more than just who the leader is and what the leader does. That's kind of where our next set of theories goes. Questions about motivation? Okay. Erin, you want to pass out the study guide? So I put together a study guide for y'all this morning, and I'll upload a PDF of it to Canvas too later today. I made it while I was looking at the exam. But what I didn't do is I obviously didn't give y'all practice questions or things like that. But I kind of said, I know that these are things that are going to be asked about on the exam. So don't just, there's space there for you to write out definitions. But again, put examples. If we talked at all about, okay, big 5, these are the 5 personality dimensions. Here's what the 5 mean. We also talked about then which was most highly correlated with effective leadership, which weren't. You want to be able to write those things down too. So just know that this is a guide, but you've got to kind of help fill in that information there. Take a second to look it over and just see if there's any part of the guide that you do have a question about. Huh?
When is the exam?
Exam's Tuesday.
Oh, it's on Tuesday.
Yeah.
I don't know why my head was on Wednesdays. I don't even have this class on Wednesday.
Nope.
Oh my gosh.
We have a sales exam on Wednesday.
Oh, shoot. Okay, thank you.
I can't believe y'all are doing this.
Any questions about the study guide? Borrow one real fast. On the very back, I did put some exam 1 details. And I provide this to y'all because I don't really get the point in like hiding from y'all what an exam is going to look like. What good does that do anybody? Secondly, is that I hope that if you know how the exam is going to be structured, it can help you structure how you study. So for instance, there's going to be 50 multiple choice questions, only worth 1 point, right? But there's going to be some matching, short answer, fill in the blank. My suggestion to you, and I think this is a good study habit to do for any class that you're in, okay? Very first thing here on your study guide says definition of leadership. If I asked you a short answer, what is the definition of leadership? Write it out. Make yourself a multiple choice question that says, what is the definition of leadership? Provide some, practice writing test questions, y'all. Have y'all ever done that? That is probably one of the best study habits you can use. Like, it has been shown to help students do better on exams because you're thinking ahead. You're anticipating what could possibly be asked. Write out the definition and make it a fill-in-the-blank question, because you never know, it could be one, right? 5 power bases, 3 reactions to power. It could be a fill-in-the-blank. It could be a matching question. It could be scenario-based, where you have to identify such and such did this. Which power base did they use, right? Practice writing test questions for these. Please, please, please don't focus just on being able to define what they are. That is very low-level, knowledge-level thinking. And this is a 3,000 level class. I want y'all to be able to apply concepts, synthesize concepts. And what that's going to require you to do is to read some scenarios and based off of what's there, be able to draw out what concepts being talked about. Going to need to be able to compare and contrast theories, right? That's a high level of synthesization. Okay, if I said compare trait theory or the trait approach and the behavior approach, could you do it? Knowing those strengths and weaknesses of both would really help you out there. Okay? So 100 points total, 2 short answers, 50 multiple choice, 2 fill-in-the-blank questions that kind of each have multiple parts, and know that anything like that will be given partial credit, so it's not an all or nothing question. Okay? A matching question, and then you'll have 2 short answers. And what I mean by 2 short answers is like a sheet of paper, you'll have a question here, question here. So I'm looking for like a 5 to 7 sentence paragraph response. So you might make note of that. If you just give me 3 sentences, that's not going to be enough. 5 to 7, a strong paragraph. Okay. Any other questions? Erin and I will be checking our email between now and Tuesday. So if you do, while you're studying, you need some clarification, let us know. Here's my big thing, y'all. I know it is football weekend, and I want y'all to have fun and enjoy all the things that have to do with football in a safe manner. But I am only able to give an excused absence to students who have contacted me due to a COVID-related reason or have another university excused absence. So you're expected to be here on Tuesday for that exam. Think about that. I just want y'all to think about that. You have an exam on Tuesday. What do you have to do if y'all are in situations where perhaps you're not following safe protocol for COVID? Quarantine. Okay. Let's make smart decisions, please, this weekend, okay? And I'll see y'all Tuesday.